Our first speaker today is Herna ndez Dura, who completed his doctorate at the University of Chicago and is currently Associate Professor of Spanish Colonial Art History at the University of New Mexico in Albuquerque. His courses cover Indo-Hispanic Americas from 1496 through 1898. His primary research interests include 18th century art of New Spain, 19th century Mexican art and museography, and art historiography. Ray has been the recipient of various awards, including, deep breath here, a Fulbright Hays Fellowship to Nigeria, a Fulbright Hays Fellowship to Mexico, a MacArthur Fellowship, a National Endowment for the Humanities grant, and more recently, a Fulcrum Fund grant from the Andy Warhol Foundation. Among his publications are articles in numerous journals and edited volumes, as well as his very fine book, The Academy of San Carlos in Mexican Art History, Politics, History, and Art in 19th Century Mexico. Ray, welcome.
Well, good morning. Thank you for being here. I would like to begin by thanking both Nika and Kate for extending an invitation for participation in the symposium this weekend. I also want to thank our mutual colleague, Anna Marley, who works at the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, for bringing me to their attention. And finally, thank you to the Courtauld and to everyone who made this event possible. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you this morning. All right, so from Novohispanic Castas to Mexican citizens, colonialism, race, and the Academy of San Carlos in Mexico City. The first academy in the Western Hemisphere, the Academy of San Carlos in Mexico City, what was then the imperial capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, was chartered in 1781 following a petition by the Spanish official, Jerónimo Antonio Gil, who had been appointed head engraver of the mint in the viceregal capital. The petition was approved by the Viceroy, Martín de Mayorga, and later confirmed by the king in 1783, following the arrival of Mayorga's replacement, Matías de Galvez, who acted as patron of the newly established academy. A project that looks at the art institution in Mexico from 1750 to 1850 begins with the decline of Spanish colonial rule in the Indo-Hispanic Americas and ends with the first 3 decades of an independent Mexico. This relationship between race and art institutions, I should add, is a topic that has never been examined before. So what I'm presenting today is really a preliminary step into looking into this really fascinating topic. The transition from Spanish viceroyalty to modernation was turbulent and destabilized the region economically and politically for decades. The United States invasion of Mexico in 1847 and the subsequent annexation of the northern half of Mexican territory in 1848 further debilitated the struggling nation. Examining the relationship between race and the Art Academy during this period reveals how institutional practices reflected first imperial and later national political ideologies and official attitudes towards Mexico's unique racial diversity. But first, a bit of history. When in 1519, Spanish conquistador Hernan Cortés first set foot on the eastern shore of what today is Mexico, it is estimated that approximately 25 million natives inhabited the region. In 1520, an epidemic of smallpox introduced by the recent arrivals quickly spread among the indigenous population, reducing it from 25.2 million in 1519 to 1.2 million by 1620. In the mid-17th century, the native population gradually began to recover, reaching pre-conquest numbers by the 19th century. A decade after the conquest of Mexico, the Spanish crown decided to implement a viceregal system in the Americas, as it had done in parts of Europe. The objective was to strengthen the crown's authority in the empire's distant territories, in part by improving oversight. With the arrival of the first viceroy, Antonio de Mendoza, and the gradual pacification and restructuring of the territory that followed, the migration of Iberians to central New Spain grew. With the increased presence of Spanish women, a new social class began to emerge, the criollos, or Creoles, many of who, racially identified as white, came to form a new aristocracy in the developing social hierarchy. To the Americas, from approximately 1545 through 1600, diverse groups of peoples moved not only across the Atlantic, but also the Pacific. The trade route between New Spain and the Philippines, established in 1565, facilitated the movement via the Manila galleon, not just of goods, luxury materials, and foods, but also migrants from the Philippines, Japan, China, and India. The introduction of African slaves to the Spanish-American territories began in 1501, but it was in 1518 that the Spanish crown approved the importation of slaves directly from Africa via Portuguese traders, officially initiating the slave trade with Spain and the American territories. Between 1519 and 1580, approximately 36,500 enslaved Africans are estimated to have been taken to Mexico, with the height of the slave trade occurring between 1580 and 1640, and the estimated black population in New Spain in 1650 at 140,000. Given the Spanish legislative code known as the Siete Partidas, which provided avenues for the manumission of slaves, Mexico's population of free blacks grew considerably throughout the 18th century. By 1821, 3,000 blacks were enslaved, with the majority of individuals of African descent living as free people. It is estimated that in Mexico's 300-year colonial period, approximately 200,000 slaves were transported to New Spain. By 1600, New Spain was home to a diverse population consisting of a mostly rural, majority native demographic, itself diverse ethnically and culturally, a growing, primarily urban Creole population, a small but diverse Asian presence, a small but growing, also primarily urban black community, mostly slaves, but also including free blacks, an increasing stream of peninsulares, or Hispanics from Spain. Throughout the 17th century and into the 18th, the castas, or castes, mixtures of European and Indian, European and black, and Indian and black, increased exponentially, with European and Indian miscegenation dominating. Following the death in 1700 of the last Spanish Habsburg, Charles II, the newly installed Bourbon monarchy found itself inheriting a bankrupt global empire that was facing external threats and various internecine conflicts. In the Americas, Bourbon officials encountered a vast territory populated by large urban centers spread across thousands of miles and inhabited by pluralistic societies where racial mixing was the norm. From the Bourbon perspective, corruption, inefficiency, and lack of adequate oversight during the Habsburg period had resulted in significant economic losses and a lack of adequate regulation. The Bourbons, critical of how the Habsburgs had mismanaged Spain's vast empire, sought to strengthen imperial authority, restructure the territories, fortify the empire's defenses, and increase efficiency and productivity. The policies that were implemented to actualize these changes, collectively known as the Bourbon Reforms, although motivated by economic and political concerns, extended to the cultural sphere, which implicated the arts, given their utility in terms of generating tax revenue, circulating imperial propaganda, and actualizing the crown's modernizing objectives. Bourbon officials throughout the 18th century were critical of what they found in the Americas. Among the various concerns, and those relevant to this paper, were the rampant miscegenation, in particular with blacks, encountered throughout the viceregal territory, and what they perceived as a lack of stylistic uniformity and quality in local art production, which they believed was due to the distance of the viceroyalties from European cultural centers. The Bourbon crown was supportive of native rights and privileges. This interest in improving the standing of Indians is exemplified by the awarding of scholarships to eligible native youths for whom several places were reserved at the academy. The same, however, did not apply to blacks. For example, in 1778, the colonial government implemented a law known as the Royal Pragmatic, or the Pragmatic Sanction, which gave parents legal authority to prevent the marriage of their children if there was substantial social inequality between them and their chosen partners, a law that effectively impeded legal marriages between blacks and other groups. Given the proliferation of workshops led by artists of varying backgrounds, training, and skill, and this is before the academy, it was a master-apprentice system that was regulated by guilds. Colonial art production was diverse in style and quality, something that the Bourbons judged to be inferior, a sign of decadence, and a result of the lack of proper institutional controls. As the 18th century proceeded, the churrigueresco style that had been introduced and promoted by the Bourbons in the early 18th century fell out of favor as neoclassicism took hold in Spain. The Academy of San Carlos, founded by Peninsular Petition, was meant to be a tool with which the Bourbon crown could implement programs aimed at civilizing or modernizing its American territories. These objectives included centralizing arts education and artistic training in one institution. Additionally, given that the Academy was founded during a period of revolutions and growing American unrest, San Carlos was seen as a mechanism the Bourbon government could use to disseminate pro-monarchy propaganda in an attempt to diffuse increasing hostility towards Spain and its colonial government. In light of these objectives and other Bourbon concerns, local culture and local politics were generally not the focus of academic instruction and its artistic production. Instruction at the Academy of San Carlos promoted a more rigorous emphasis on classical models and drawing, focused on the copying of prints, on studies made after plaster reproductions of classical and Renaissance sculptures that were commissioned, produced in Europe, and then sent to Mexico City, and drawing from life. Painting followed the practice of European academies with a focus on academic history painting, portraiture, and still life, although in New Spain, religious subjects continued to comprise a major part of academic art production throughout this period. The subject matter across media and genres, including sculpture and printmaking, was overwhelmingly classical, with prints and public monuments often employed to disseminate imperial imagery. Representations that referenced daily life or that gave form to local racial realities were absent from academic art of the late colonial period, with one notable exception. A major commission of the Spanish instructor of painting, Rafael Jimeno y Planes, who we see here in the portrait to your left, was his monumental painting, El Milagro del Pocito, or The Miracle of the Spring, or the Fountain, from 1802. The painting, intended for the chapel of the Palacio de Minería, which was an engineering or mining school that the Bourbons founded in Mexico City, depicts in an academic history format an episode of the story of the apparition of the Virgin of Guadalupe to the Indian Juan Diego in 1531. In the painting, three figural groups inhabit a rocky landscape. The main group is centered on the figure of Juan de Zumárraga, the first Archbishop of Mexico, who points to a fountain of water that has miraculously appeared from a stone. He is flanked by religious officials, a group of peninsulars or Creoles, and a figure on horseback. Kneeling to the Archbishop's immediate right is Juan Diego. To the right, we see a group of natives gathered next to a tree, but it is the figural group to the left that is of interest. Standing on a wagon is a white male figure who faces away from us and looks directly at Zumárraga. The figure raises his arm in response to the Archbishop who is addressing him. Seated on the wagon directly behind the standing figure is a darker-skinned individual, possibly indigenous or mestizo, who rests his right foot on the back of a black man lying on the ground partially beneath the wagon. The racial content and the hierarchical arrangement, which are out of place not only in the narrative, but in the historical period that is being referenced, appear to reference the caste or casta system of New Spain, particularly as codified in pinturas de casta. A genre of 18th century painting, the pinturas de casta depict the results of the mixing between Spaniards, Indians, and blacks, what are considered the three parent groups. A popular subject before the founding of the Academy, casta paintings gave visual form to the racial dynamics unique to central New Spain, seen by Bourbon's officials as a curiosity at best, and definitely as detrimental to the social and cultural integrity of the viceroyalty. As a genre of painting, pinturas de casta did not correspond to the types of subjects that were recognized or promoted by the Academy. The production of pinturas de casta, not coincidentally, diminished and ultimately disappeared once the Academy was founded. Jimeno y Planes' inclusion of a racialized casta reference in the painting of one of Mexico's foundational myths, a narrative tied to a religious icon that had taken on political symbolism during this period of revolution has led certain scholars to suggest that this painting, and thus this anomalous racial reference, could be read as privileging or monumentalizing the Creole, possibly signaling Jimeno y Planes' support of Mexican independence. This is a topic that needs research. It's something I'm going to start looking into now as a result of working on this paper. It's fascinating. The independence movement in Mexico, primarily motivated by criollos, or the white upper class, began in 1810 when the Creole priest Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla mobilized rural indigenous communities and led the first rebellion against the peninsular presence in New Spain. The movement culminated in 1821 when Mexican military leaders declared Mexico's official independence from Spain. After 1821, the Mexican government passed two important laws, at least important for today's topic. The first law, implemented in 1822, just a year after independence, prohibited the identification of Mexican citizens by racial status in any official expressions. And the second law, proposed in 1829 by Mexico's first black president, Vicente Guerrero, abolished slavery. The first law was proposed as a way of countering the hierarchical caste system identified with Spanish colonialism and reflected an interest in promoting the idea that all inhabitants of Mexico were equal citizens. While these political developments were unfolding, Mexico was facing dire economic circumstances. The country's bankrupt status rippled throughout Mexican society and came to affect the academy. During this period, circa 1822 to 1835 more or less, enrollments decreased and faculty salaries disappeared, causing the academy to shut its doors. From 1826 to 1834, the Mexican sculptor Pedro Patiño Ixtolinque, who had been a professor of sculpture at the academy, served as the troubled institution's director. Of native heritage, he had been awarded one of the scholarships reserved for indigenous students at the academy prior to independence. During his time as head of the academy, Patiño Ixtolinque produced two of his most well-known works intended for a funerary monument dedicated to José María Morelos, another Afro-Mexican figure who was a hero of the independence movement. The sculptures were titled Liberty and America. America is an allegorical representation of the American continent. Neoclassical in form, the figure wears symbolic objects associated with American indigeneity. These become sort of stereotypical symbols of the Americas throughout the colonial period. These include the feathered headdress that she wears, almost like a European crown, which does not exist, and a quiver filled with arrows. Representations of living indigenous figures were absent in the art production of the academy during this time. When a visual reference to an Indian is found, as seen here, it is either allegorical and symbolic or idealized and historical. During the period that the Academy of San Carlos was shut down, European and American visitors to Mexico City noted the deplorable state of the Academy and its galleries, and they lamented the absence of a national art museum. In the 1830s, Mexican President Antonio López de Santana, who typically is vilified, he was a problematic leader, but he did do some good things, concerned that this observation reflected badly on Mexico, he requested the construction of a gallery of Mexican national art, initiating the Academy's remodeling and eventual reopening in 1846. As San Carlos was being refurbished and expanded, a search was conducted in Europe for new faculty. Two of the hires included the Spanish painter Pelegrín Clavé and the sculptor Manuel Villar. Pelegrín Clavé had traveled to Rome as a student, where he encountered the Nazarenes, a group of primarily Austrian artists led by Johann Friedrich Overbeck, who looked back to the religious art of the medieval and Renaissance periods, which they emulated in their own work. I mean, the Nazarene movement was running out of steam by the 1840s, but it found new life in Mexico, thanks to Clavé. Arriving in Mexico City in 1846, just as the Academy was to reopen, Clavé focused on history and religious painting and on promoting the Nazarene principles he'd learned in Rome. From 1846 through the 1850s, much of the painting and sculpture produced by faculty and students in the Academy were either historical or religious in nature. And here are two examples, one of Clavé's history paintings, which tended to focus on Columbus and the beginning of the Spanish global empire, and an example of one of his superstar students, Joaquin Ramirez. They were all Old Testament subjects that were being depicted. As had been the case before, images of natives were either historical or allegorical, or the subjects were religious. References to blacks or other racial groups in academic instruction and art production were intentionally erased. And again, Manuel Villar, the sculpture, this is a neoclassical type sculpture that illustrates or depicts a historical indigenous figure from the pre-conquest period, Tlahuicole, who was a member of the Tlaxcalan group, who had resisted the Aztec. And at this point, this is shortly after the US has invaded and absorbed half the nation. So the Mexicans were identifying with this figure. If you notice, his ankle is tied to a post. He is being sacrificed by the Aztecs, but he is fighting back. They identified with Tlahuicole, and the US was identified with the Aztec, who were an oppressive presence. References to race and depictions of racial types in the 19th century were widely produced. They were popular and produced, but as was the case with 18th century pinturas de casta, they circulated outside of the academy in the form of costumbrista expressions. Inspired by European artists such as Carl Nebel, who traveled to Mexico after 1821 and expressed interest in the natural landscape, the local culture, and ethnic types, non-academic Mexican artists began to paint the world around them, starting in the 1830s. Here are two examples. One of the most famous 19th century painters, Jose Agustin Arrieta, and then to the right is a lithograph by Carl Nebel that served as a source of inspiration for Mexican artists, and two other examples of Arrieta's paintings. The scenes of daily life painted by costumbrista artists did not reflect or cohere with the types of subjects taught or promoted at the Academy of San Carlos. The focus on daily life and ethnic types was considered inferior to the grand historical and religious themes that were the focus of the work of Academy, faculty, and students. So just concluding statement, a preliminary survey of the intersections of race and the Academy of San Carlos from 1750 to 1850 indicates that the Academy intentionally avoided racial representations during the first century of its existence, but for various reasons. In the late Viceregal period, the Academy functioned as a branch of the Spanish Imperial government and was founded to introduce the neoclassical idiom and its ideas to the American territories in an attempt to civilize, modernize, and regulate American viceregal cities and their inhabitants. The focus was primarily in architecture in the Americas. Given the academic principles that were deployed, local subjects were not of interest since they did not correspond to or reinforce imperial objectives. After the independence movement, new priorities tied to nation formation shifted the focus of academic subject matter, but still within a neoclassical vocabulary. The only racialized presence is of the Indian, rendered here as a palatable symbol of the nation's past. When the Academy reopened in the mid-19th century, the background and interests of the European faculty, in tandem with the current politics in the capital, promoted history painting and religious images in academic art production. In both cases, the late colonial period and the early national, depictions of race were of interest, but were produced and circulated independently of the Academy. As a former colonial territory, independent Mexico found itself in a predicament. Through its institutions, it aimed to emulate European models as a demonstration to the rest of the world of its accomplishments and worthiness. However, its history, cultural forms, and its inhabitants were not European. How to negotiate its racial realities became a challenge, one that its institutions avoided, but that artists working outside of the limits imposed by those institutions tackled head-on. Thank you. Thank you.